Hidden in a public park on the outskirts of Coventry is a remarkable fragment of history, an 8-foot-thick sandstone wall with red sandstone decorative inlay, a remnant of a medieval building. Neglected for centuries, little was known about this ruin. Urban myth suggests that it was part of a great castle, destroyed in the Civil War, and the resting place of St. George, who was mortally wounded saving Coventry from the dragon. But the reality is quite different. This was once a grand manor house owned by some of England's most illustrious families, but it fell into decline when the money ran out.
Caludon has been this romantic, mysterious ruin. It actually contains a rich tapestry of history.
What it becomes as Caludon Castle would have stood out against the manor houses and the residences of almost everyone else.
To have such a high-profile house and then for it to stop being a high-profile house, that's quite an unusual feature of it, really. And that's one of the intriguing things about it.
This is the story of the rise and fall of Caludon Castle, and how a local boy with a lifelong passion for history put it back on the map. These days, Caludon is a 20-acre park in the Coventry suburb of Wyken, close to the University Hospital. But the earliest mention of a manor of Caludon goes back to sometime between 1190 and 1200. Prior to the Norman invasion, the land which would make up Caludon was owned by the Earl of Leofric and Lady Godiva. After her death in 1067, this land was taken over by the Earls of Chester. Unlike other local manors like Wyken and Sow, which had existed since the time of the Domesday Book, Caludon appears to have been a newly created estate, an amalgam of parcels of land from different sources.
There wasn't a village of Caludon. That is quite clear. The name is Saxon. There are two syllabi, Calu, which means bear, and Don, which means hill. So it was a bare hill, and it was on the bend of the River Sow, south of Sow itself and Wyken.
Journalist and former chairman of Coventry City Football Club, John Clarke, was born and raised in the suburb of Wyken, a stone's throw from the castle ruins.
I was born and bred just 100 yards from the castle, so it played a very big part in my childhood. It was obvious that a monument of that size with a moat had some real history to it.
He's been on a mission since childhood to research the history of Caludon Castle.
I started in a very small way. I drew the castle. I was only aged 12, but I suppose my real interest was when I went to Caludon Castle School and saw all of these shields all around the school hall. And I researched the owners, and they were amongst the most aristocratic families of their period. Fortunately, the teachers found that I'd got this interest in local history and produced for me a green exercise book with the potted history of Caludon Castle over about a dozen pages. That was it. And I started thinking, wouldn't it be a dream to produce the first ever authoritative book on the history of Caludon?
The first great family to appear in John's green exercise book was the Seagraves, a remarkable example of social mobility during the economic boom of the 13th century.
The family came from Seagrave in Leicestershire. Stephen's father, Gilbert, was a minor royal official, very minor. Stephen followed in his footsteps. The great chronicler, Matthew Paris, describes him as a flexible man, which I think perhaps says everything. And because he was high in royal councils, great lords and so on wanted to keep in with him. He was a rising power. So they tended to pass properties to him.
The records show that the 6th Earl of Chester granted the manor of Caludon to Stephen de Seagrave early in the 13th century. This was a status symbol for a man who had risen above his modest beginnings. Over time, he acquired other neighbouring lands to extend the estate, and he built a wooden manor house on the smaller moated area to the south of the remaining ruins around 1217.
The Seagraves were quite large landowners. A lot of their land was in Leicestershire and Northamptonshire. So Caludon was just another estate, but they seemed to be interested in Caludon because it provided an opportunity to create a park. They created a deer park, essentially, out of Caludon. And the farmland that was to the west, they probably just rented out to neighbouring tenants.
Stephen's great-grandson, John de Seagrave, was another loyal servant to the king.
He was a military man. He fought for the king in France, but most particularly, he fought for Edward I throughout his Scottish wars. He was also called to Parliament in 1296 as a baron. So John de Seagrave takes the next step, as it were, in terms of social elevation. He is no longer a minister in the way that Stephen de Seagrave had been. He's now a baron in his own right.
In 1305, he was tasked with hunting down the famous Scottish rebel, William Braveheart Wallace. Wallace was hung, drawn and quartered, and Seagrave was responsible for transporting his remains to the four quarters of the realm. One of his rewards from the king was the granting of a licence to crenellate at Caludon.
Crenellate means to build fortifications, but it's very often it's only building a manor house, a substantial manor house.
Of course, a lot of these places were not fortified in the sense that they would have withstood a major siege or something like that. It was as much fashion and status. But to crenellate, to have turrets, you had to have royal permission, a royal licence. And yes, it's a measure of his relationship with the king that he's allowed this, but they also tended to pay for it as well.
A much grander manor house was built on a new and larger moated site to the north of the original location between 1320 and 1350.
In wanting a crenellated manor, he was also pointing to the fact that he was a very successful soldier and part of the military elite of the country.
When the second John de Seagrave died in 1353, his sole heir was a daughter, Elizabeth. She'd married John Mowbray in 1349, and so it was that Caludon became the property of the Mowbray family. The Mowbrays were an illustrious and influential family. John's son, Thomas Mowbray, became one of the most powerful men in the country, being made Earl Marshal of England in 1386 and Duke of Norfolk in 1397. The Mowbray family fell in and out of favour with the crown, and they lost and regained control of Caludon several times during this period. Perhaps the most famous incident was the Battle of Gosford Green, a duel between Thomas Mowbray, Lord of Caludon, and his rival Henry Bolingbroke on 16th of September 1398, immortalised in Shakespeare's Richard II. The king stopped the duel and banished both parties. Bolingbroke later returned to England and became King Henry IV, but Mowbray died abroad and the Caludon estate was forfeited to the royal household. It was eventually granted back to Thomas's son John Mowbray V in 1413.
The king had always had an interest in what was going on, and if they could make some money out of what was going on, then they'd certainly try and do that. And especially when there are heirs who haven't reached maturity, who are underage.
In 1476, the last surviving heir of John Mowbray VII was his daughter Anne. At only 5 years old, she was betrothed to Prince Richard, aged 4, the son of Edward IV. Richard was one of the famous princes in the Tower, whose deaths remain shrouded in mystery to this day. Like Richard, Anne died at the tender age of 9. With her death, the Mowbray line ended and their estate was divided.
The 15th century, where it moves from ownership of the Mowbrays to eventual ownership of the Berkeleys, where I think it's a very confusing picture. The Crown gets involved, other families are involved, there's all sorts of legal machinations.
In 1494, the tangled web of legal challenges was resolved, and control of Caludon passed on to the Berkeley family. Maurice Berkeley V was the first to hold the estate, but it was his grandson, Thomas Berkeley VI, and his son, Henry, a godson to King Henry VIII, who did more to improve Caludon Castle than any other owner.
The Berkeleys succeeded to Caludon in 1494 and spent nearly 140 years there until 1631. Theirs was the heyday without a shadow of a doubt.
They've got huge estates in Gloucestershire, and yet in the latter half of the 16th century, Henry Berkeley and his wife Catherine much prefer Caludon, and they decide to make it much more comfortable. A medieval house is a big open hall, and by the 16th century, open halls are out of fashion.
Put in bedrooms and private rooms and made it much more of a country house, but also built gardens, and there was lots of other buildings built. They had dozens and dozens of servants, liveried servants, so it was very much an aristocratic grand home.
Henry and Catherine may have preferred Caludon's more cosy, intimate feel, but the quality of hunting available at Caludon perhaps also explained their enthusiasm for the place. Henry the Harmless, as he's dubbed in Berkeley family history, was a generous and humble man. He gave daily to the poor at the castle gates and was renowned for sitting at low table with the low-ranking guests rather than with the great nobility during their Christmas parties. Detailed accounts kept by the family's steward, John Smith, provide a fascinating insight into life at Caludon under Henry and Catherine's ownership.
John Smith was an administrator and a steward to the Berkeleys, but he was an extremely assiduous collector of material and produced a history of the Berkeley family.
The Berkeleys brought Caludon to life. They're connected with King Henry VIII, they're connected with Elizabeth I.
They were great entertainers. They had actors, players, fools, magicians there on a regular basis.
They could indulge their passions for hunting, for entertaining, for patronage of the arts, for dancing and gaming, and all the things that aristocrats like to do and spend their money on.
One name that appears in Smith's accounts is that of renowned lutenist John Dowland.
John Dowland was a top musician. He was renowned, if not all over the world, certainly across Europe. And I know the Berkeleys spent a lot of money bringing him to Caludon to entertain.
Both Henry and Catherine were keen lute players themselves, and in 1565, Henry bought Catherine a beautiful lute, highly decorated with mother of pearl. Unfortunately, Queen Elizabeth had already offered 100 marks for the instrument, and she was not pleased at being outbid. Lady Catherine came from the powerful Howard family and already had a volatile relationship with the Queen. Both her father and her brother were executed for treason. But Elizabeth did agree to be godmother to Henry and Catherine's son, Thomas. Thomas went on to marry Elizabeth Carey at a society wedding in London in 1596. Elizabeth was the granddaughter of Lord Hunsdon, sponsor of Shakespeare's plays The Lord Chamberlain's Men, and it's argued that Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream was written for their wedding. Smith's accounts show how Caludon under Henry and Catherine became a key driver of the local economy.
While Caludon was owned by Lord Henry and Lady Catherine, they enjoyed a lavish lifestyle. So it brought a lot of people, a lot of visitors to Coventry, their guests, high society guests. It kept a lot of people in work. At one point, Lord Henry is reported to have had 150 servants at the castle, which is incredible and absolutely unimaginable. But also, more than that as well, it had there were local businesses that supplied the castle.
The accounts are for month by month by month of almost everything. It's workers' wages, repairing the buildings, regilding the rooms, buying expensive clothing. There's even one record which fascinates me. A good wife askew is paid 1 shilling for 7 weeks to empty the loo.
When Catherine died in 1596, Smith describes her being laid to rest with the greatest state and honour that for many years before had been seen in the city or in those parts of the kingdom. She was buried in St Michael's Church, now Old Coventry Cathedral, and her funeral procession was 1/4 mile long. Henry organised a characteristically generous wake at Caludon afterwards, with enough food to feed 1,000 poor people from the leftovers. The vast expense associated with their lavish lifestyle surpassed Henry and Catherine's income. The estate, which had previously taken 3 pages to list in John Smith's chronicle, in 1 generation had been reduced by 1/3 to pay off immense debts. In 1631, because of the financial predicament that the Berkeleys continued to find themselves in, they had to sell the Caludon estate to Thomas Morgan of Hayford Manor in Northamptonshire. From the 1630s onwards, Caludon Castle rapidly descended from being the principal seat of the Berkeleys to an oversized farmhouse estate, leased out piecemeal to tenants.
So the house is divided, and that's the beginning, I think, of the deterioration.
Around 1685, the estate passed into the control of the Clifford family, under whose care many of the original papers and artefacts relating to the estate have been preserved. However, the state of the main castle building declined rapidly over this period, and it had to be demolished between 1730 and 1748, with only the fragment of the medieval chamber we see today remaining. Stone from the castle was used to construct new farm buildings.
What was left of Caludon, and we don't know what its state was, is demolished, and a new farm is built. The house is built just within the moat itself, but the farm buildings are built on the east side of the moat, so separated by the moat from the farmhouse itself.
In 1814, the estate was partitioned and advertised for sale in the local press. The Cliffords sold the farm and farmhouse to a Reverend John Brown in 1822, and, separately, the lordship of the manor to the Earls of Craven in 1846.
A manor has got 2 meanings: the physical buildings and estate, and there's the lordship. The lordship gives you the right to hold a manorial court and earn money out of that, to take the minerals out of the ground. It's an intangible, the lordship.
Certainly, mineral rights were suddenly looked at with some relish by aristocratic families because the Industrial Revolution, basically, everyone wanted coal.
The Cravens had a strong interest in coal mining locally, and it's likely that they acquired the lordship of Caludon with a view to mining on the site. This could have destroyed the last remnants of the castle, but fortunately no mining ever took place there. By 1880, the farmhouse had been converted into a gentleman's boarding school, Caludon College, which had just 6 pupils. Although this only lasted for about 10 years, it was a sign of things to come. Caludon Castle School was built on part of the former estate and opened in 1954 with places for over 1,000 students. As the city of Coventry expanded, the Caludon estate was gradually sold off and built upon until by the 1930s all that remained was an area of 20 acres, roughly equivalent to the original deer park, containing the castle ruins and the 2 moats, which had been scheduled as ancient monuments by the Ministry of Works in 1922.
What happens then is Coventry. It advances towards Caludon and envelops Caludon, but very fortunately the council decides to buy 20 acres of the much bigger original estate, which is about 300 acres, to create a park and to preserve what was left of Caludon Castle within that park itself.
The The park and ruins continued to deteriorate until the early 2000s due to the effects of weather and vandalism.
I was driving down one evening, early summer's evening, and saw a builder's barrier right across the entrance. I thought, that can't be right. This is a social amenity for families, you know, for the elderly, dog walkers. So I contacted Coventry Council and got through to their parks department. Funnily enough, I got a very good reception, and they told me that there'd been some vandalism, but they were forming friends groups throughout the city, including Caludon. Could I help them? So I called a meeting at Caludon Castle School, put some notices around, and had about 50 people turn up. Here was I in a suit, so I think they were a bit suspicious of me, but I said I was a Wycombe boy, so that broke the ice. And we formed a group, about 10 of us, and started looking at ways we could improve the park. With the help of the council, there was new playground equipment, there were gates. There was no doubt the park improved, so much so that we got the Green Flag, an award for the best parks in the city, and that has continued to this day.
The castle wall itself was also in need of attention.
Sadly, the stonework in the middle of the windows has been vandalised, but otherwise it's the same ruin as it was under the Cliffords.
It wasn't too bad when I first came in 1990, but in the 2000s it needed a bit of restoration. There were weeds growing and buddleia growing off the top, and so I managed to get some money together to scaffold it and just get the stonework repaired and the top sealed again.
Inspired by the Friends of Caludon, John returned to his dream of producing a definitive history of the castle. But he knew he needed expert help.
There was a big gap. Following sixth form and going into journalism, building my career, working for some fairly large companies in PR, and then forming my agency, I didn't have a lot of time. Of course, I got married, had children. Didn't have a lot of time to devote to the research. But in 2006, I thought to myself, if I don't do this now, it's not going to happen. And a friend of mine, Stephen Johnson, who was a manorial expert, agreed to do some research for me.
I don't think any new research had been done on Caludon for 100 years, maybe, something like that. First thing you do really is work out, well, who owned this? And when was it built? Who owned it? What's the sort of descent? And once you've sort of worked that out, then you can use that as a sort of springboard to go off to this record office, that record office, or, you know, this source, that source, where you can start then gathering more information, putting it together, and you start to build up a picture.
John also commissioned archival researcher and former head of conservation and archaeology at Coventry City Council, George Demidovitz, to work on the book.
What intrigued me about Caludon was just this lump sticking out of the moat in a 20-acre park, municipal park, with no history. Or if there was something, there were tales of St. George being born there, which I knew were completely wrong. And I was just intrigued about perhaps creating a history where there wasn't one before.
Although I'm a trained journalist, remember I'm a novice in terms of producing books. And in the end, it just got bigger and bigger in terms of 75,000 words, 230 pages, and hundreds of illustrations. It was a fantastic experience because we were working as a team. George, Stephen, my daughter Samantha.
I saw him with the draft of the book and I said to him, what is that? And he told me. And I said, oh, well, can I have a quick read? It was a really lovely hot summer's day. It was a Saturday. I was planning to spend the day in the garden. And I took the draft out with me to read. It was going to be a half an hour read and I ended up working on the book for the next 3 years. So yeah, it was good.
The biggest challenge was finding documentary evidence from which to piece together a timeline for the history of the manor.
The only way to establish a history is to go into the documents, to find the documents, and that was the big problem. Go to Coventry archives, very little on Caludon, surprisingly enough. Nothing there at all.
The major breakthrough came when John established contact with Lord Clifford of Ugbrook in Devon a direct descendant of the castle's 18th century owners. Stephen Johnson was invited by the Clifford family archivist to visit Ugbrook's muniments room to view artefacts relating to Caludon. These included the original licensed crenellate granted to John de Seagrave in the early 1300s. George and John then made a second visit to Ugbrook.
The whole treasure trove of the archive of Caludon Castle and its owners going back to the 13th century was in the muniments room of Ugbrook, the seat of Lord Clifford. It was an absolute light bulb moment to us.
I just couldn't believe it. My eyes popped out. I said, there's a history of Caludon to be written here now. It's here. It's in Devon.
The history of the castle was finally falling into place, but one great mystery remained. What did Caludon look like in its heyday?
A key part of the book was to understand what it looked like. There are no drawings, no paintings, nothing existed, which was a big disappointment. So George and I decided that we would jointly fund, George was with the council at the time, what is called a resistivity survey, which are electronic beams that go down to the foundations. Fortunately, the foundations at Caludon were only a few feet below. So the resistivity survey gave us a footprint of what the castle looked like. The Great Hall, the Great Chambers, the entrance, where the gatehouse was. It was a remarkable discovery from which we could actually rebuild the castle with the help of our illustrator, Pete Urmston.
We've got the footprint and it's a case of extruding up then from that footprint, but it's a question of trying to find out what went on top of those stone foundations. Was it timber? Was it stone? Now, obviously, in Caludon's situation here, we've got a remnant, which gives a good indication of what part of it looked like.
The lack of any drawings of the castle presented a particular challenge in terms of building up a vision of what the buildings were actually like.
We can't tell from the ground plan who did what.
We know that certain things were there, like the castellations, but do we know they were there at the same time as, say, the window design or whatever? Probably they were. Did they overlap, or were they two completely different construction periods?
Pete drew inspiration from other buildings of the same period to fill in the gaps.
Kenilworth's Great Hall was very similar, and other moated manors, and Berkeley Castle I seem to recall looking at the time, Hever Castle, places like this that were built between round about 1250 and 1650.
These remarkable illustrations give a clear view of how Caludon would have looked under Henry and Catherine Berkeley at the end of the 16th century.
We chose the 1590s because it was the zenith of Caludon, obviously. The Berkeleys were there at their height, they were entertaining, they were remodelling the castle.
With the historical research and the illustrations finally in place, the book was published in 2014, with a foreword by Lord Clifford of Ugbrook.
Caludon tumbled from family to family through the centuries, from Seagrave to Mowbray, and from that name to Berkeley, then Morgan, Preston, and to my own family, which cosseted the estate for nearly 200 years, before death duties and distance induced its sale in the 19th century. It gives me great pleasure to know that John Clarke has taken on the mantle as an avid historian to not only preserve and protect, but also to celebrate the lordship of the Manor of Caludon. Whilst John Clarke and his family act as loyal custodians of the historical legacy which has embraced the Manor of Caludon for more than 800 years, no politician will be able to eradicate that sense, that value of heritage, which ensures the everlasting existence of the British spirit.
Stephen Johnson did an excellent job, and particularly finding the records of Caludon through Lord Clifford. George took it to the next level and formed what has been described in the press as an authoritative history of Caludon, which is a great compliment. And we had the book on the BBC, TV, BBC Radio, local press.
As a history book, I think it's an amazing achievement, really. To have something of such value, I think is incredible. I think it has a wider impact on the history of Coventry as well, because it's a big part of Coventry's history.
Building on the success of the book, John looked to ways to share the story of Caludon with a wider audience.
One of my ambitions with the project, and there have been several, was to rebuild a model, a scale model of the castle. And just before the pandemic, I read in the Coventry Telegraph of an amateur model maker called Peter Garbett. And over a period of 6 months at his home, he took the information we could provide about Caludon, referred to the book, and produced what was essentially the first ever scale model of Caludon Castle. And the nice thing about that is that we could take the model around local schools, and the children, many of whom played over the park, could see this castle wall converted into an actual castle.
A key objective of the project was to engage Caludon Castle School, where the young John first read about the Seagraves, Mowbrays and Berkeleys in that green exercise book.
I think it's fair to say that the school pupils and the teachers knew little about the history of Caludon, other than the ruin that was 200 yards away in the local park. I formed a very good relationship with the head teacher of the time and actually launched the book at the school, which I thought was very appropriate. What was really pleasing to me was that the school embraced the history and actually put it on the school curriculum.
And John's research has established Caludon as a more prominent part of the history of the city of Coventry. Much of the Clifford family's archive of Caludon-related material has now been loaned to the Coventry Archives at the Herbert Art Gallery Museum. And this partnership was launched with a 2-month public exhibition at the museum.
So the exhibition took place in 2022, and it was a marvellous experience. Over 2,000 people attended. Lots of publicity about the castle. So once again, we're educating people about the history. And there was a lot of interest. It was fantastic.
Even John Dowland's performance at Caludon has been celebrated with a series of Caludon-themed concerts of Dowland's music by the renowned early music group Lacrimée Consort.
Mike Ashley, who was the founder of the Lacrimée Consort and an accomplished lutist, took a great interest in Caludon Castle because John Dowland, who was the Sting of the period, actually performed at Caludon in 1598. For the princely sum of 40 shillings. But that was a hell of a lot of money in those days. And as part of the performance, he engages the services of an actor portraying John Smith, the chronicler and steward of Caludon Castle, who talks about life at Caludon, which really enhances the performance.
But why, at this time, are the Berkeley family living in a manor house at Caludon rather than their really grand and historical home of Berkeley Castle? Well, I think Caludon was much more comfortable, particularly in the winter. We did have 20 fireplaces. Most importantly, the hunting was excellent. Of course, the very wealthy Berkeley family owned many estates and houses around the country, but Caludon just became their favourite.
But what of the many myths and legends associated with the castle? St. George adorns the castle gates. Is it true that he was born and died at Caludon?
There are so many legends about Caludon. The one that can be discounted more than any of those legends is that St. George was born there. He wasn't. But the legend continues, and it's great for Caludon's profile.
St. George was martyred in 303 AD. So it's impossible for him to have been born at Caludon and to have died there.
My theory on that, having done quite a bit of research, is it was a marketing exercise by the city, basically. It was a way of putting Coventry on the map.
I think what happens is that a performance is carried out at Caludon of the St. George legend. It's just twisted to entertain the Berkeleys, bringing Caludon into the story. So he's born at Caludon, he's injured by the dragon and drags himself to Caludon and dies there. That Caludon story was given its final form by Richard Johnson. That story then gets published. It's his rendition of the story that's been repeated and repeated and repeated.
And what of the idea that the castle was destroyed in the 17th century during the English Civil War?
That just happened to be just guesswork. They were thinking, well, there's a ruin. What might have brought it down? The Civil War. The answer is no.
The castle was demolished by the Cliffords in the early 18th century. It had fallen into disrepair and they wanted to build a farmhouse.
One remaining area of debate is what links existed between Caludon and William Shakespeare. Did he ever visit there? And was one of his greatest plays really written for the wedding of Thomas Berkeley?
Shakespearean scholars are famous for never agreeing with each other. But one suggestion is that Midsummer Night's Dream was written to entertain the guests at a wedding. And one of the weddings suggested has been the wedding of Thomas and Elizabeth. There is a link because Elizabeth was Elizabeth Carey and her father and grandfather were patrons of William Shakespeare and his company. So if there was going to be an entertainment for the wedding, then Shakespeare was the obvious person to write it, and it's been suggested that it was Midsummer Night's Dream.
Shakespeare lived only 20 miles away. He actually performed 6 times at St Mary's Hall in Coventry, and there was a connection between Lord Henry and Shakespeare. However, there's no record, unfortunately, of Shakespeare performing at Caludon.
We know that companies of players went there, and important companies of players, because we've seen the payments made to them. So they know that these national bodies were coming to Caludon to perform the great plays of the day. So to me, it would be really odd to think they didn't go there, and at least one of his plays performed there. It's just frustrating that there isn't the evidence that we can find yet.
When John Clarke was awarded an OBE in 2005 for services to the community of Coventry, Caludon, of course, featured front and centre.
I'd been involved in a lot of community activities in the city, and I was absolutely surprised to be awarded this honour, but it was a great privilege. When you are awarded an OBE or an honour, you are allowed to petition for your coat of arms. This entails going down to the College of Arms and, in my case, meeting the Garter King of Arms. He worked with me to design the coat of arms and we discussed a motto. I wanted Caludon to be part of that motto. And as the project has been a major inspiration in my life, a major hobby, I thought Caludon meus instinctus, Caludon my inspiration, was absolutely the correct words to put on the motto.
His passion for the project has been passed on to his daughter Samantha, who's working with him on a second edition of the book, including a digital version, which they hope will reach a wider audience.
Caludon's always been a part of my life, but learning more about it as I have, it's taken it to a whole new level for me. I'm now the 4th generation of our family to have lived within a stone's throw of the castle. So it's always been a focal point down the generations. Caludon has stood there for centuries, and I hope it stands there for centuries more, and I hope it's protected and preserved, and that local children, Caludon Castle school children, but also, children from all over Coventry really, I hope they continue to take an interest.
John has devoted nearly 50 years to his love of Caludon and the mission of uncovering its long-lost history. With the help of his team, he's finally succeeded.
I do visit the park most weeks, and I do have a feeling of emotional ownership. I'd probably like to be remembered as the Wycombe boy who had a dream to uncover the rich tapestry of history, 800 years of history that was Caludon.
A romantic sandstone ruin, rising sentinel against the winter sky. whilst bright sun cast down golden rays across once magnificent moat. Mirroring 800 years of history, unveiled before you, Caludon Castle. Legendary birthplace of St George of England. Now ruined, standing proud, whose ancient walls bear witness to a noble past from a bygone age. Deafening silence, though history calls. Where was once upon a time a great hall filled with laughter, merriment of titled lords and ladies therein, feasting in sumptuous style from long tables laid before them. A banquet of venison and game, fruits of the land, the spoils of hunting in the park at early dawn. And from a corner the gentle lilt of music lifts the air, the celebrated lutenist Dowland playing from the stair, before the lord and lady of the manor, family and guests nobly served by 70 servants, all loyal to the test. Ghosts of distinguished names past, echoes of Seagrave, Mowbray and Berkeley, powerful families of the land. Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk and Bolingbroke, whose battle at Gosford Green was ended by the king and celebrated in Shakespeare's own hand. Such richness of nobility. Chapters of a story from a colourful historical tapestry, woven through the centuries at Caludon, a rich inheritance, indeed from a time gone by, but sadly no longer witness to the eye. And today, children play in the park, tiny silhouettes dwarfed by the long shadows of the sun-kissed castle ruin, gazing in wonderment at a monument of days long past, dreams of a romantic age one can only imagine. But in time, childhood memories that will surely last. Lordship of the Manor of Caludon, seat of titled families who made their mark on centuries of British history, proud heritage impossible to sever. Lords and ladies, Caludon, thy name will live on forever.